Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're turning our attention to a city that's been in the news a lot recently and has been for most of the past decade.
Yeah, Aleppo, Syria.
Hmm,
A place that most Americans probably couldn't have found on a map 15 years ago, but now is synonymous with the Syrian civil war.
exactly. And it's back in the news because of a pretty surprising rebel offensive.
Yeah, one of the strongest we've seen in years, actually.
It's been, what, like almost a decade since we've seen fighting at this scale in Aleppo?
Yeah, the last major offensive was back in 2016.
Which ended with Syrian government forces and their Russian allies retaking the city. So set the stage for us. Why is this offensive different? Could this be a turning point in the war?
Well, it definitely has the potential to be a turning point. I mean, you have to remember that the Syrian civil war has been raging for 13 years now.
Yeah, a conflict that's really had a ripple effect across the entire world.
Yeah, 500,000 lives lost, millions more displaced. And, there are conflicts already going on in Gaza and Lebanon. So, a successful offensive in Aleppo could further destabilize the entire region.
So who are these rebels leading the charge?
Well, the group spearheading this offensive is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS for short.
HTF.
And they have a really complicated history.
I was going to say that name sounds familiar.
Yeah, the U.S. and the UN have both designated them as a terrorist organization.
So that complicates things a bit. If they're considered a terrorist organization by the international community, why are they launching an offensive like this? What are they hoping to achieve?
It's kind of like HTS was walking a tightrope. They emerged from al-Qaeda's Syrian branch, but they've been actively trying to distance themselves from that legacy.
Oh, wow.
They claim to have broken ties with al-Qaeda completely,
Mm-hmm.
and they've even started to present themselves as protectors of other religions. I mean, they even allowed the first Christian mass to be held in Idlib in years.
So almost a complete 180 then from a group that we would traditionally think of as an al-Qaeda affiliate to one that is promoting religious tolerance.
Exactly, and that's where the tightrope analogy really comes in. So while they're promoting this image of moderation, they've also allowed other wanted groups to operate within their territory. And they've even fired on U.S. Special Forces back in 2022.
Wait, they fired on U.S. forces. So this is where I get a little confused. If the U.S. considers them a terrorist organization, why haven't they targeted HTS's leadership more directly?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it speaks to the complexity of the situation there on the ground in Syria. The U.S. has troops in northeast Syria,
Right.
which is pretty far from Aleppo,
Yeah.
and they're primarily focused on preventing ISIS from making a comeback. And, their priorities might not perfectly align with labeling every group that is opposed to the Syrian government as a terrorist organization, especially if those groups are also fighting against ISIS.
Right. So strategically, it's just not that simple. They have to pick their battles, I guess, so to speak.
Exactly. And that's what makes this offensive in Aleppo all the more unpredictable. You have all these different groups with these shifting alliances all operating within this larger conflict.
Right.
And then you bring in international players like Russia, Turkey, and Iran.
Oh, yeah. It's a powder keg for sure.
And it feels like every week there's a new headline about some potential conflict.
Right.
So it really is like a high-stakes chess game with constantly changing rules.
And Aleppo is right at the center of the board.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
And Aleppo is so much more than just this battleground. I mean, it's a city with a history spanning literally thousands of years.
I was just thinking about that. Like, what was Aleppo like before the war? I mean, what made it so significant?
Well, for centuries, Aleppo was this vibrant hub. It was like a crucial stop on the Silk Road.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So imagine caravans laden with silk and spices and merchants from all over the globe, all converging on this one place. It was renowned for its architecture, its beautiful, bustling bazaars, and its rich culinary traditions.
It's hard to reconcile that image with what we see today. Just bombed out buildings, deserted streets. I mean, when did things start to unravel for Aleppo?
Well, the war really started to take its toll in 2012, when rebels seized control of the eastern part of the city.
Oh, okay.
Before the conflict, Aleppo was home to over 2 million people. So, a bustling metropolis full of life and energy.
Yeah.
And that all changed with the outbreak of fighting.
And then came the siege of 2016, right? I mean, one of the
Yeah.
most brutal chapters, I think, of the entire war.
Yeah, it was devastating.
Yeah.
The siege was a turning point, for sure.
Right.
But for all the wrong reasons.
Mm.
The Syrian government, with Russian support, launched this relentless campaign to retake the city.
Yeah.
And the images from that time are just truly haunting. The indiscriminate use of barrel bombs,
Yeah.
these crude but just devastating weapons raining down on civilian areas.
I mean, it was a level of brutality that really shocked the world, right?
It did.
Yeah.
And it really exposed the human cost of this conflict. Just the sheer disregard for civilian life.
Yeah, it was really hard to watch.
The Syrian government's strategy was basically to just break the will of the people,
Right.
crush any resistance. And tragically, it worked. By the end of 2016, Aleppo was back under government control, but the city was in ruins.
Yeah.
The people were traumatized,
Yeah.
displaced.
Yeah.
Their lives were shattered.
And now with this new offensive, it just feels like history is repeating itself.
It does.
Yeah, these old wounds are being ripped open again, and the people of Aleppo are just caught in the middle.
Yeah, you're right. And, we also have to remember that there are other actors involved in this conflict as well. Israel, for instance, has conducted airstrikes in Aleppo, targeting Hezbollah and Syrian government forces.
Right.
So that just adds another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation.
So can you help me connect the dots a little bit? How does this offensive fit into the larger regional picture?
That's a great question, and it's essential to understand the broader context here. This offensive isn't happening in a vacuum. It's playing out against the backdrop of the simmering conflicts between Israel and Hamas in Gaza and between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And then you have these powerful nations like Russia, Turkey, and Iran, each with their own agendas in Syria.
Right, so many competing interests. So what are the potential outcomes here? I mean, what happens if the rebels succeed in their offensive?
Well, if the rebels manage to gain significant ground, it would be a major blow to the Syrian government and its allies.
Yeah.
And it could embolden other rebel groups and potentially lead to a wider destabilization of the region.
Okay, and what if the Syrian government, with Russian support, pushes back and defeats the rebels? Where does that leave us?
That's certainly a possibility. The Syrian government, with the backing of Russia and Iran, has proven to be pretty resilient in the past, and they could launch a counteroffensive and utilize their superior firepower to try and crush the rebellion. But even if they succeed, it's unlikely to bring a definitive end to the conflict.
So either scenario paints a pretty grim picture for the people of Aleppo. I mean, more violence, more displacement, more suffering.
Yeah, the human cost is immense, and that's something we just can't afford to overlook. We're talking about a city that has already endured so much destruction and loss. Many of its residents have been displaced multiple times in their lives, just completely upended by the war. And this offensive will just exacerbate their plight. It's going to lead to further displacement, more suffering, more lives lost.
I can't even imagine what these people are going through. I mean, what are some of the challenges that they're facing on a daily basis?
Would just imagine trying to rebuild your life in a city that's constantly under threat. Access to basic necessities like food, water, medical care becomes incredibly difficult. Schools are often closed or destroyed, so children are deprived of an education. And the psychological toll is immense. People are living with this constant fear and uncertainty.
Yeah, it just breaks my heart to think about. It seems like a political solution is the only way to break this cycle of suffering.
You're absolutely right. Military victories alone won't bring lasting peace to Syria. What's needed is a comprehensive political settlement,
Right.
one that addresses the root causes of the conflict and creates a framework for a just and sustainable peace.
It really puts things in perspective.
It does.
Behind the headlines and all the strategic analysis, there are real people whose lives are being torn apart by this conflict.
Absolutely. And, the humanitarian crisis in Aleppo and really across all of Syria is just a tragedy of immense proportions.
Millions displaced.
Millions displaced, families shattered, and, access to even the most basic necessities like food, clean water, medical care is a daily struggle for so many.
Yeah. As we try to wrap our heads around the potential ramifications of this offensive, I mean, what should we be watching for? What signs could indicate a shift in the balance of power, or maybe even a glimmer of hope for some kind of resolution?
Well, one key factor to watch is the potential for direct conflict between Russia and Turkey.
Oh.
Both countries have significant interest in Syria. And while they've managed to avoid direct confrontations so far, the risk of escalation is always there.
And I imagine if two major powers like that were to clash in a region that's already so volatile, I mean, what would the consequences be? Could it draw in other actors? I mean, could it potentially expand the conflict beyond Syria's borders?
Exactly. And it's a scenario with potentially disastrous consequences.
Yeah.
Not just for the region, but potentially for the wider international community.
Yeah.
Another critical factor to watch is Iran's role.
Right.
They're a key backer of the Syrian government,
Mhm.
and they've been steadily expanding their influence in the country.
It seems like they're kind of playing the long game,
They are?
quietly positioning themselves
Yeah.
as a major player in the region. So
Exactly.
what are the implications there, both for the conflict itself, but also just for the future of Syria?
Well, Iran's involvement just adds yet another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation.
Mm.
Their interests and their goals don't always align perfectly with those of Russia or the Syrian government. And this could lead to further friction down the line. And of course, we can't forget about extremist groups like ISIS. They've been relatively quiet in recent years, but the potential for a resurgence is always there, especially if the conflict intensifies and creates these power vacuums that they can exploit.
So for our listeners who are maybe feeling a little overwhelmed with all this information, what's the most important takeaway from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the situation in Syria is incredibly fluid, it's complex, and unfortunately, it's incredibly volatile. This rebel offensive in Aleppo represents a significant shift in the dynamics of the conflict and has the potential for far-reaching consequences. We really had to pay close attention to the evolving relationships between the various actors, both internal and external, and recognize that the path toward peace in Syria remains a long and difficult one.
It is a sobering thought, but I think it's essential to grapple with the reality of this situation. And as we've discussed, the fate of Aleppo, a city that's already endured so much, hangs in the balance. And the ramifications of this conflict, they extend far beyond Syria's borders. It really highlights just the interconnectedness of our world and the devastating human cost of war.
It does, and it leaves us with a profound question. Can a city and a country so deeply scarred by war truly find a path to peace and reconstruction? Can the people of Aleppo who have faced unimaginable suffering ever hope to rebuild their lives and their communities?
Those are questions that stay with you long after you step away from the headlines. And we've explored the history, the key players, the motivations, the potential outcomes. And it's clear that there are no easy answers. But perhaps by shedding light on the complexity of this conflict, we can all play a role in advocating for a more peaceful future for Aleppo, for Syria, and for the world.